Fire split the sky like a clean wound, and a pair of crimson Omega Beams carved down through concrete and air, while an entire city folded into a theater of light and ruin. People screaming, trains buckling, and office towers shedding their skins like frightened animals. At ground zero, a man in a faded yellow suit stood among tumbling glass, and a rain of rebar, hair flat, expression blank in the way of someone waiting for the grocery store to open, and the beams that erase suns traced him with precise, clinical intent. The god who sent them watched geometry and purpose fail to convert into annihilation, and the battlefield registered that failure like a new signal, a ripple of calculation and alarm that moved through armored command centers and into the streets. Around that single, inexplicable survival, everything altered. Orders that assumed inevitability became urgent, weapons that assumed compliance were remade into hunting tools, and leaders who thought themselves safe began to draft contingencies for an outcome they had never imagined. This is not the end. It is the first dangerous fracture of a system built on certainty, and what follows will be far worse. Viewer, subscribe now. This is not casual entertainment, it's a warning. You are choosing to watch what happens when an ultimate weapon fails and the people who relied on it begin to hunt for answers. If you stay, expect consequences that cannot be undone. Subscribe to know what comes next. The first Omega Beam didn't arrive like a blast so much as a verdict, sliding across the skyline with a deliberate curve that made the laws of distance feel optional as it bent around collapsing towers and through a plume of dust that had once been a shopping district. Saitama had been standing in line at a convenience store that no longer existed, holding a discount coupon that the wind was trying to steal from his fingers, when the pavement ahead of him folded inward as if the street itself had been asked to leave. A second beam followed the first, tracking with an almost bored precision as it corrected for the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and then both of them struck him squarely in the chest without ceremony or pause. The impact didn't burn or pierce so much as it relocated him, driving his body through a vending machine, a wall, and the support column of a parking structure that began to tilt in delayed surrender as he exited the far side. He landed on his back beneath a sliding curtain of concrete, blinking once as the dust swallowed his view, and somewhere far above a voice that did not need volume decided to try again. The next pass came from a different angle, because whatever controlled the beams had already accounted for momentum, trajectory, and the simple possibility that the target might have moved in the time it took to bury him. They hooked around the sinking edge of the parking deck and followed him through a settling avalanche, slicing apart falling girders as if they were cardboard props, and then finding him again in the shallow crater his body had made on impact with the next street over. Saitama sat up, looking briefly annoyed in the way of someone who has misplaced their change, while a city bus skidded past him without wheels and came to rest against an overturned taxi. The beams pressed into him with the same impersonal insistence, and the ground under his heels turned into a trough that dragged him across asphalt toward a storefront that still had mannequins standing in the window. When the mannequins shattered from the pressure wave and the storefront collapsed on top of him, the beams followed him inside the debris without hesitation, as though walls were merely suggestions. High above, Darkseid adjusted nothing with his hands because he did not need to, but the Omega Effect tightened in response to an outcome that had not yet occurred in any other engagement. The target's mass was known, the energy required to erase it was trivial by his standards, and the beams were already operating with perfect lock, yet the result had been a displacement rather than a deletion. The rubble that had swallowed Saitama convulsed outward as a section of ceiling gave up and slid down the pile, and for a moment the beams vanished into the particulate storm before reappearing on the far side, still latched to the same unmoving chest. Saitama's cape had been reduced to a torn ribbon by friction against a steel beam, and he brushed it once as if deciding whether it was worth fixing later. Then the floor beneath him gave way under the continued push, and he dropped into a basement that smelled faintly of detergent and old cardboard. On a nearby rooftop that was in the process of becoming a lower floor, Genos had arrived with his sensors already screaming about a threat profile that refused to map to anything in the Hero Association database. He saw the beams curve like intelligent whips around a falling elevator car, and then reattach to Saitama with the patience of a machine that had never failed. And the readouts on his right arm began to populate with error messages that implied absence rather than damage. "Sensei," he called out over a channel that was already cluttered with evacuation orders, but Saitama's response was delayed by the fact that he was being pushed through a row of industrial washing machines. The building across the street shed its facade in a single cascading sheet, and Genos fired thrusters to close the distance, watching the beams ignore him as though he were a reflection on glass. Darkseid's interest moved from passive to active in the time it took for the Omega Beams to revise their parameters, because the first sanctioned outcome had not materialized, and the second would need to be more persuasive. The beams split and rejoined in a lattice that passed through the basement and out the opposite wall, dragging Saitama sideways through a load-bearing pillar that surrendered with a sound like a snapped bone. When he emerged into the alley, he was still upright, still blinking dust from his lashes, and still holding the crumpled coupon that had survived the transit with more integrity than the surrounding architecture. A delivery truck overturned in slow motion as the ground buckled under the lateral force, and Saitama put a hand on its fender out of habit before realizing it wasn't going to fall on him after all. The beams brightened without heat, and the alley extended itself into a trench. Across the district, the Hero Association Command Center watched a satellite feed that refused to align with any known category of weapon, and a dispatcher named Akiyama found herself repeating the same sentence to 3 different teams as the casualty projections tripled. "Primary target remains mobile," she said, even though mobility was not the correct word for someone being continuously relocated by an existential phenomenon. A live drone caught Saitama tumbling through the wall of a pharmacy and into a rack of bottled water that burst like a shallow wave, and the beams arrived a half-second later as though they had been waiting for him to land. The operator zoomed in, expecting a silhouette to collapse into ash, and instead saw him sit up with a look that suggested he had been interrupted during a nap. Darkseid escalated without ceremony, because the Omega Effect did not require patience when certainty had been inconvenienced, and the beams widened into a paired arc that carved a clean path through 3 adjacent structures. Saitama's trajectory shifted upward this time as the force lifted him through a staircase that disassembled around his knees, and for a moment he found himself above the dust line with a clear view of a sky that no longer agreed with itself. The beams remained attached, pulling him across open air toward a radio tower that had begun to list as its anchors failed one by one. He collided with the latticework at chest height, paused there as if considering the situation, and then continued through as the metal surrendered in neat, obedient lines. Genos reached the alley just in time to see the tower's upper third begin its descent, and he diverted power from his left arm to create a stabilizing blast that bought a handful of civilians a path to the next block. "Sensei, please relocate," he said into a channel that was now pure static, as the beams redirected Saitama into the falling structure and pinned him against its spine. The tower met the street in a sound that erased the rest of the block, and the Omega Beams followed their target into the settling wreckage without pause. Beneath a new mountain of twisted steel, something shifted. By the time the dust from the fallen radio tower began to settle into something that resembled gravity again, the Omega Beams had already adjusted their vector twice to compensate for a target that had not stopped existing when the structure met the street. Saitama was somewhere inside the new geometry of twisted antennae and pancaked service floors, not struggling so much as waiting for the pressure to finish deciding what it wanted from him, while the beams threaded through gaps that had not been there a moment earlier. When they found him again, they did not strike with any visible increase in heat or volume, but the ground beneath the wreckage sank as if the city had agreed to lower him into storage. The resulting collapse carried him through a maintenance corridor and into a sublevel parking bay where the lights had survived long enough to flicker once before giving up entirely. Genos descended through a rent in the tower's spine and landed on a tilted concrete slab that groaned in protest under his weight, his optics struggling to reconcile a weapon that behaved like a decision rather than an omission. He saw the beams curve around a fallen SUV and reconnect with Saitama's chest, as though nothing in the intervening meters had been worth acknowledging, and his threat assessment updated itself into a format he had never needed before. Impact analysis indicates non-thermal displacement, he reported to an association channel that had begun to route civilian frequencies by mistake, because nothing in their playbook addressed a phenomenon that ignored obstacles without accelerating damage. Saitama, half buried beneath a parking barrier that had been folded into a question mark, looked up at the red light touching his suit and said that it felt like someone was pushing him with a flashlight. Darkseid did not speak, but the Omega Effect responded to the description by escalating its intent beyond simple erasure and into a more instructive mode that had ended wars on worlds where time itself had been negotiable. The beams split into filaments that crossed Saitama's outline in a grid, tracing a geometry designed to separate presence from continuity, and the parking bay convulsed as the pattern imposed a new set of directions on the concrete. Instead of vanishing, Saitama slid backward along a path that the beams had created for him, leaving a shallow trench in the floor as the vehicles around him lifted and then settled in a new arrangement. A support column sheared at mid-height and rotated into his shoulder without finding purchase, and the ceiling above him dipped in sympathy. On the surface, evacuation sirens had begun to argue with one another as different districts tried to prioritize routes that no longer existed, and the Hero Association's live map replaced a clean grid with a bruise that spread block by block. A Class Hero Stinger arrived at the perimeter with a squad of responders who were already being asked to retreat, and he watched a pharmacy facade peel away as the beams pulled Saitama through the building's interior in a straight line that ignored the staircase. The street bowed as if someone had pressed a thumb into wet clay, and a water main erupted into a geyser that immediately froze into mist against the heat of friction from moving debris. "Is that tracking?" one of the responders asked, as the red arcs hooked around a tumbling ambulance to remain fixed on their target. Genos attempted an intercept that he knew would fail but executed anyway, because a variable that refused to be named still deserved to be tested. He fired a containment blast at the point where the beams intersected Saitama's silhouette, hopping to disrupt the path long enough to relocate him to open ground, and watched the energy disperse like breath on glass. The Omega Beams did not deviate, and the blast instead disassembled a section of floor that sent Saitama down another level into a loading dock where forklifts had been left mid-shift. The beams arrived a heartbeat later, pulling him across painted lines and into a stack of shipping crates that burst open into a spill of detergent boxes and canned soup. Darkseid's interest hardened into irritation that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a system, reporting that its fundamental promise had not been kept. The Omega Effect deepened its sanction, attempting a correction that had once trapped a god in an endless sequence of lives that never reached adulthood, and the air around Saitama seemed to hesitate as the beams tightened their hold. Instead of disappearing, he was lifted a meter off the ground and pressed through the dock's exterior wall, emerging into an alley where a billboard had just decided to fall. The billboard met his back and then parted around him as the beams dragged him into the street beyond. Across the command center, Akiyama found herself watching a slow-motion feed of Saitama being pushed through a city bus that had been abandoned with its doors open, and she realized that the casualty projections had become irrelevant to the problem they were actually facing. "All units, maintain distance from primary target," she said, even though distance had not helped the buildings that were being cut to accommodate his path. A drone tracked him as the beams redirected again, pulling him across an intersection where the traffic lights still cycled through their colors as if nothing had changed. He stumbled once when his foot caught on a bent street sign, and then continued, carried sideways into a storefront that sold shoes. Stinger moved to assist civilians who had taken shelter behind a newsstand that no longer had a roof, and he saw Saitama pass through the opposite wall of a bank without slowing down, the Omega Beams following like an obligation. The bank's vault door shuddered as the trench extended beneath it, and the building began to tilt toward the avenue in a motion that would not stop. Gino's voice cut through the static with an update that sounded less like data and more like disbelief. Sensei remains unharmed. Above the district, Darkseid revised his approach once more, and the beams widened into a paired arc that carved a path through the next block to create a cleaner line of force. Saitama was lifted off his feet and carried toward a construction site where a crane had been left mid-swing, its cable snapping as the trench reached its base. He collided with the suspended load, paused as the pallet of bricks disassembled around his shoulders, and then continued into the open pit as the beams refused to let him settle. By the time Saitama disappeared into the construction pit, the Omega Beams had already rewritten the map of the surrounding district into something that city planners would never recognize again, because every straight road now contained a shallow channel where his body had been dragged through asphalt. The trench did not end at the site's perimeter fence, but continued beneath it, curling around stacks of rebar and cutting through a temporary office trailer that had been bolted to the ground an hour earlier. When the beams pulled him into the open foundation, he landed among a grid of reinforcing bars that bowed outward as his weight met them, and the concrete forms around the pit began to crack as the force redirected. A cement mixer toppled into the excavation with a slow inevitability, its drum still turning as it met the edge, and then surrendered to the depth. Inside the Hero Association's central operations floor, the screens that had once been reserved for disaster simulations now carried a live feed that refused to obey predictive modeling, and the analysts who had been trained to quantify threats found themselves reporting absence as if it were a measurable outcome. Omega-class targeting continues, an engineer named Kaido said, though the classification had been invented less than a minute earlier to give the phenomenon a place in their system. The association's executive board had convened without ceremony, their discussion moving from evacuation logistics to liability in the span of a breath, as the cost of lost infrastructure outpaced the initial damage estimates. When a drone relayed footage of Saitama being pushed through a temporary retaining wall and into a stack of steel beams, the legal team stopped asking whether the city could be saved and began asking how to preserve what remained of their authority. Gino surfaced at the lip of the pit as the Omega Beams dragged Saitama along the bottom, leaving a furrow that filled immediately with dust and broken aggregate. He deployed a cluster of micro-drones into the excavation, hopping to build a real-time model of the beam's pathing, and watched each unit veer aside as if encountering a pressure gradient that could not be measured by instruments. "Trajectory remains perfectly locked," he reported, because the beams curved around a fallen formwork panel and reattached to Saitama's chest with the same calm persistence they had shown on the surface. Saitama, now wearing a shallow dent in his glove where a brick had tried to argue with him, looked up at the red arcs and asked if anyone else could see the lines. Elsewhere in the city, the association's corporate partners began to route private security assets toward districts that had not yet been touched, because the live map showed a problem that moved with purpose rather than spreading randomly. A logistics firm that owned 3 adjacent warehouses requested authorization to seal their perimeter, and a telecommunications provider initiated a blackout to preserve network integrity in case the phenomenon began to interact with their infrastructure. The result was a patchwork of darkened blocks that made the trench easier to see from orbit, a thin, deliberate scar that extended from the convenience store where Saitama had been standing to the construction site where he now lay. When the beams redirected again and pulled him into the pit's drainage tunnel, The tunnel's curved ceiling split into segments that fell in sequence. Darkseid observed the systemic response without interest in its human motives, because the Omega Effect had already begun a higher-order sanction that should have removed the target from all relevant contexts. The beams tightened into a double helix that passed through the drainage tunnel and into a stormwater conduit, dragging Saitama along the shallow channel as the city's runoff systems failed around him. Instead of vanishing into an absence that would have satisfied the equation, he emerged from the far end with a thin coat of dust, and a piece of rebar caught briefly in his cape before it slid away. The conduit's exit ramp collapsed as the trench reached daylight again, and a delivery drone that had been attempting to return to base clipped a lamppost and fell. Back in operations, Akiyama authorized a corporate emergency clause that allowed private construction equipment to be commandeered for civilian evacuation, because the next redirection had pulled Saitama toward a hospital complex that could not be moved. Heavy cranes began to rotate in anticipation of creating a barrier that might divert the path, and a line of armored transports repositioned to form a corridor for patients being wheeled into the street. The Omega Beams curved around the first crane's extended arm and remained fixed, pulling Saitama through a row of plastic barricades and into the hospital's service entrance, as if the building had opened its doors for him. Genos arrived seconds later, watching the beams thread through an automatic door that had not finished opening, and he felt the limits of his design in the way his sensors refused to categorize what they were seeing. "All units clear the sublevels," he said, because the trench had begun to form along the hospital's main corridor, tiles popping loose in a neat line that extended toward the elevators. Nurses and orderlies moved aside as the floor bowed, and a vending machine slid into the path before being parted around Saitama's shoulder. The beams did not flicker. Above the complex, Darkseid revised the sanction once more, and the Omega Beams brightened without heat as they prepared to impose a solution that had never failed to complete. The hospital's east wing began to tilt as the trench reached its foundation, and the first cracks spidered up the facade while Saitama was pulled toward the imaging department, still unharmed and still mildly confused by the red light that refused to go away. The hospital's east wing did not collapse all at once, but began with a slow, almost thoughtful lean that traveled floor by floor as the trench reached its foundation, and asked the structure to reconsider its alignment. Saitama was pulled along the main corridor past a row of gurneys that had been hastily abandoned, his boots dragging over tiles that lifted in a precise line beneath him, while the Omega Beams threaded through ceiling panels and light fixtures without slowing down. When the corridor narrowed near the imaging department, the walls flexed outward as if making space, and a bank of monitors toppled from a nurse's station to burst into a scatter of glass that the beams ignored. He glanced once at a poster that suggested the benefits of regular exercise, then continued as the floor gave way under the continued push. Genos followed at a distance that he knew would not be sufficient, watching the red arcs curve around a metal crash cart and reconnect with Saitama's chest as the elevators at the end of the hall chimed for no one. "Sublevel integrity compromised," he reported, because the trench had begun to extend beneath the operating theaters, and the vibration alone was enough to send a rolling stand of instruments into the wall. A patient transport bed slid across the corridor as the building shifted, stopping just short of Saitama's path before the next redirection pulled him through a reinforced door that had been designed to contain radiation. The door did not resist. Outside, the association's evacuation corridors unraveled as the live map updated to show a path that now cut across 3 districts with deliberate turns that did not correspond to streets. A line of buses attempting to leave the medical complex found their route split by a shallow channel that opened beneath their tires, and the lead vehicle tipped forward as the asphalt surrendered. Stinger coordinated a human chain to move those who could not walk, glancing up in time to see the hospital's east facade shed a curtain of windows that shattered against the ambulance bay. The Omega Beams emerged from the service entrance a moment later with Saitama in tow, pulling him into the open where the trench could deepen without walls. Darkseid observed the expansion with a focus that had replaced irritation with calculation, because the sanction had begun to affect the environment more reliably than the target it was meant to erase. The beams widened their arc and cut across a city park that had been designated as a refuge point, the grass folding into a shallow trough that displaced a row of benches and sent a playground slide into the path. Saitama passed through the slide's support ladder without noticing, and the beams followed him across a decorative pond that parted around his legs before closing again in a confused ripple. The park's perimeter fence bowed outward and then snapped. In the command center, Kaido authorized the deployment of corporate demolition teams to preemptively remove structures along the projected path, because the trench had begun to undermine a fuel depot that could not be allowed to rupture. Explosive charges were placed along a row of abandoned storefronts to create a buffer zone, and the detonation arrived just ahead of Saitama as the Omega Beams pulled him through the smoke into a cleared avenue. The cleared space did not slow him but prevented the immediate collapse of adjacent buildings, and for a moment the evacuation route held. Genos used that moment to attempt a lateral relocation, firing a grappling line toward a streetlight and pulling himself into Saitama's path to interpose his own frame between the beams and their target. The red arcs curved around him with perfect indifference and reattached to Saitama's chest, dragging both of them across the avenue toward a subway entrance where commuters had been shepherded below. "Please step aside," Saitama said, because Genos' shoulder had caught on his cape, and then the stairs gave way as the trench reached their base. They descended together into the station. Across the city, private security units began to withdraw from districts that had not yet been touched, because the phenomenon's path no longer respected municipal boundaries, and the next turn would take it toward a financial hub that could not be evacuated in time. The subway's tiled walls split as Saitama was pulled along the platform, and a train that had been halted mid-evacuation shuddered as the trench passed beneath its wheels. The Omega Beams followed him into the tunnel, carving a clean line through the darkness that the emergency lights could not outshine. Above, Darkseid revised the sanction again, and the beams brightened without heat as they prepared to impose a higher-order correction that had unmade entire timelines. The tunnel's ceiling began to shed dust in a steady rain, and the train's coupling snapped as the ground beneath it shifted. Saitama was pulled toward the far end where the tracks curved, still unharmed and still holding the crumpled coupon between two fingers as the city rearranged itself around his path. By the time Saitama reached the curve in the subway tunnel, the Omega Beams had already begun to extend their influence beyond the city's immediate grid, because the sanction that had failed to erase him was now demanding a solution from the environment at every available scale. The tracks ahead lifted in a shallow arc as the trench approached, and a maintenance cart that had been left on the line slid toward him with a sound that echoed down Ethiopic letter 120A the tunnel like a warning. When the beams pulled him through the cart's frame, its welded joints parted in sequence, and the tunnel's concrete lining shed a ring of dust that followed him as he moved. The emergency lights flickered once and then steadied, illuminating a path that did not need illumination to remain fixed. On the surface, the National Disaster Response Network activated protocols that had never been tested outside of simulation, because the live satellite feed showed a continuous channel carving its way beneath critical infrastructure, with a precision that suggested intent rather than chaos. Armored engineering units were dispatched to districts that lay ahead of the projected path, their orders shifting from evacuation support to terrain denial as the phenomenon approached a power substation that supplied half the metropolitan area. When Saitama emerged from the subway's far exit into a service lot, the Omega Beams followed him up the access ramp and into daylight, curving around a stack of spare rails as if the metal were an inconvenience. Genos surfaced moments later, his systems now routing data through emergency buffers as the readouts continued to return null results where damage should have been. "Military assets inbound," he said, because the sky above the substation had begun to fill with the steady thrum of rotorcraft that were taking positions along the perimeter. Saitama looked up briefly at the sound and then back at the red arcs touching his suit as the trench reached the lot's chain-link fence and pushed it outward into the street. A utility truck toppled into the channel and came to rest against a transformer housing that hummed in protest. Darkseid observed the mobilization without distraction, because the Omega Effect had already escalated into a sanction designed to remove the target from spatial continuity itself, and the failure to do so had become a variable that required strategic concern. The beams tightened into a paired helix that passed through the substation's outer wall, dragging Saitama along a service corridor where insulated cables snapped from their mounts. Instead of vanishing into absence, he was lifted over a fallen junction box and pulled into the yard where the transformers stood in neat ranks. The trench extended beneath them, and the first unit tilted as its foundation surrendered. At the perimeter, a line of armored vehicles repositioned to create a corridor for the last technicians still inside, and a flight of drones attempted to lay down a foam barrier that might slow the collapse. The Omega Beams curved around the barrier and remained fixed, pulling Saitama across a painted safety line and into the shadow of a cooling tower that began to shed bolts. Akiyama authorized a rolling blackout to prevent a cascade failure, and the district beyond the substation fell into a sudden, deliberate night. Genos attempted another intercept, this time coordinating with an engineering team to deploy a modular bridge ahead of the trench in the hope of redirecting its path toward an empty industrial zone. The bridge descended into place just as the beams pulled Saitama toward it, and for a moment the channel climbed the ramp before cutting straight through the structure's support trusses. The trusses parted around his shoulders, and the bridge settled into the trench as the Omega Beams followed him into the yard beyond. Across the operations floor, Kaido relayed confirmation that international observers had begun to track the phenomenon from orbit, because the path now extended beyond municipal limits and toward a river that supplied multiple provinces. "Global advisory issued," he said, as the live map updated to include military airspace restrictions along the projected route. On the ground, the cooling tower's upper ring shifted as the trench reached its base, and a section of the lattice began to descend. Above the substation, Darkseid revised his approach once more, and the Omega Beams brightened without heat as they prepared to impose a correction that had once erased a fleet between moments. Saitama was pulled toward the tower's shadow, still unharmed and still mildly confused, as the first section of the structure broke free and began to fall in his direction. The cooling tower's upper ring did not drop straight down but twisted as it fell, its latticework tearing loose in sections that peeled away from the main frame, while the trench reached the final anchor points at the base. Saitama was pulled across the yard toward the descending shadow, the Omega Beams threading through a rain of bolts and broken struts that clanged against the transformer housings. When the first segment met the ground, it folded inward and slid along the shallow channel that had been carved for him, as though the collapse had been scheduled to coincide with his arrival. He bumped into a fallen maintenance railing and stepped over it without looking, still carrying the crumpled coupon between two fingers as the beams guided him forward. At the perimeter, armored engineering units initiated a controlled breach of the substation's outer wall to create a spillway for the inevitable debris, their commanders now operating under a national directive that prioritized containment over preservation. Rotorcraft hovered low enough to push dust into rolling curtains that obscured the yard, and a line of heavy haulers reversed into position to evacuate portable generators that could not be replaced. The Omega Beams curved around a foam cannon stream and remained fixed, pulling Saitama through the breached wall and into an access road that led toward the river. A power line snapped overhead and whipped into the trench without finding purchase. Genos arrived at the breach as the second segment of the tower descended, his thrusters compensating for a gust that carried sparks across the yard. Sensei remains unaffected by existential-class targeting. He transmitted to a command channel that had been elevated to joint military oversight, because the readout still refused to acknowledge damage where it should have been catastrophic. Saitama glanced once at the falling structure behind him, and then at the red arcs touching his suit, as the trench reached the road's centerline and began to pull loose the reflective markers embedded there. A convoy of evacuation buses turned away at the next intersection. Darkseid observed the joint response with a strategic patience that replaced his earlier dismissal, because the Omega Effect had escalated to a sanction intended to displace the target across temporal gradients, and the result had been another relocation across pavement. The beams tightened into a narrower pair that passed through a roadside barrier, dragging Saitama along the shoulder as the access road sloped toward a levee that held back the river. Instead of disappearing into a time loop that would have satisfied the equation, he was lifted over a drainage culvert and pulled toward the embankment where the grass had begun to split. Across the operations floor, Akiyama coordinated with military liaisons to deploy earthmovers ahead of the projected path, because the levee could not be allowed to fail without consequences that would extend far beyond the city. A line of bulldozers began to cut a diversion channel toward an empty floodplain, their blades throwing up berms that might redirect the trench. The Omega Beams curved around the first berm and remained fixed, pulling Saitama up the embankment as the soil beneath him sheared into a clean trough. The river's surface shivered in response. Genos attempted to anchor Saitama with a magnetic tether tied to an armored personnel carrier, hopping to buy seconds for the diversion to take hold. The tether snapped as the beams pulled him forward, and the carrier rolled a meter toward the trench before its brakes engaged. "Please consider relocation," Genos said, because the embankment had begun to slump where the channel reached its crest. Saitama nodded once without urgency as his foot slid on loose gravel, and then he was carried over the top toward the water. International observers tracked the live feed as the trench extended down the far side of the levee, and a naval unit repositioned upriver to prepare for debris that might choke the intake of a hydroelectric plant. The Omega Beams followed Saitama into the shallows, parting the river around his knees before rejoining behind him in a confused wake. The floodplain beyond began to sink as the channel reached open ground, and the first of the diversion berms collapsed into the path. Above the floodplain, Darkseid revised the sanction again, and the beams brightened without heat as they prepared to impose a correction that had once unmade a battlefield between heartbeats. Saitama was pulled across the wet grass toward the plant's intake towers, still unharmed and still mildly puzzled by the persistent red light, as the waterline began to drop along the trench's edge. By the time Saitama reached the edge of the hydroelectric plant's intake channel, the Omega Beams had already forced the river to renegotiate its agreement with gravity, because the shallow trench cut through the floodplain and into the reinforced concrete that framed the turbines. The water that should have been flowing cleanly toward the grates instead parted around his legs as he was pulled forward, leaving a wake that closed behind him in a series of uncertain ripples. When the beams guided him across the service platform, the metal decking bowed into a neat depression that traced his path toward the intake tower, and a maintenance ladder snapped free of its mounts as if it had been asked to move aside. He paused briefly to shake water from his glove before the continued push carried him onward. Inside the plant's control room, a chief engineer named Raman watched the live feed as the Omega Beams curved around a safety railing and reattached to Saitama's chest without deviation, and he realized that the facility's redundancies had never been designed for a problem that could not be contained by walls. "Gate integrity at risk," he said into a line that now connected to military command, because the trench had begun to undermine the tower's foundation in a clean, deliberate line. Operators initiated an emergency shutdown that would take minutes they did not have, and the intake grates shuddered as the soil beneath them shifted. Genos arrived on the platform as the first turbine began to wind down, his sensors mapping a pressure differential that made no sense in the presence of a single moving body. He saw the beams split around a falling tool cabinet and reconnect with Saitama as the platform's expansion joints parted in sequence, and he deployed a set of stabilizers to keep a section of the walkway from collapsing onto a line of technicians. "Sensei remains uninjured," he reported, because the water that should have battered him simply moved aside before returning to its course. Saitama looked at the intake tower as if considering whether it would be noisy. Darkseid observed the resistance with a calculation that had replaced irritation entirely, because the Omega Effect had escalated into a sanction intended to dominate the target's continuity across causality, and the outcome had been another relocation across wet steel. The beams tightened into a denser pair that passed through the intake tower's exterior, dragging Saitama along the inner ring where the concrete had begun to flake. Instead of vanishing into a causality loop, he was lifted over a fallen conduit and pulled toward the gate mechanism that regulated the river's flow. The trench extended beneath it, and the first crack appeared along the housing. Across the floodplain, military engineers attempted to erect a counterberm that might force the channel away from the plant's core, their vehicles repositioning as the live map updated to show a new turn toward the spillway. The Omega Beams curved around a crane's suspended load and remained fixed, pulling Saitama through a bank of control panels that burst into a spray of sparks. Ramen ordered a manual release to prevent catastrophic pressure, and the spillway gates began to lift with a sound that carried over the water. Genos moved to intercept again, this time coordinating with a squad of armored responders to place a reinforced barrier ahead of the gate housing. The barrier descended into place just as the beams pulled Saitama toward it, and for a moment the trench climbed the plate before cutting straight through its support struts. The struts parted around his shoulders, and the barrier settled into the channel as the Omega Beams followed him into the spillway's throat. Above the plant, Darkseid revised his approach once more, and the beams brightened without heat as they prepared to impose a correction that had once reduced resistance to a memory. The spillway's concrete lining began to shed dust in a steady rain, and the water's pitch deepened as the gates lifted. Saitama was pulled toward the descending torrent, still unharmed and still mildly confused, as the first surge of released water began to overtake the trench. The spillway did not roar all at once but built into a steady, consuming thunder as the gates lifted, and the river's weight found a new path, pouring into the concrete throat that Saitama was being pulled through by the Omega Beams. Water surged around his knees and then his waist, parting in a confused wake where the trench had carved a shallow channel that the current could not immediately fill. When the beams guided him down the sloped lining, the reinforced surface beneath his boots began to craze in a neat line, hairline fractures tracing the exact route of his displacement. A maintenance gantry overhead shook loose a chain that swung into the path and then split as he passed through it. In the control room, Ramen watched the feed as the spillway's internal supports flexed under forces they had never been designed to accommodate, and he realized that the emergency release had traded one catastrophe for another that could not be localized. "Downstream advisory issued," he said into a line that now connected to regional authorities, because the trench had begun to extend beyond the plant and into the floodplain communities that lay in its path. Operators attempted to stagger the release to reduce peak load, but the Omega Beams curved around a falling safety barrier and remained fixed, pulling Saitama toward the spillway's lower apron, where the water struck hardest. Genos descended along the sidewall, his thrusters compensating for the spray as he tracked the red arcs through the mist. He saw them split around a tumbling inspection drone and reconnect with Saitama's chest as the apron's expansion joints parted in sequence, and he deployed a stabilizing field to keep a section of the wall from collapsing onto a cluster of responders below. "Sensei remains unaffected," he transmitted, because the torrent that should have knocked him flat instead flowed around him before rejoining the main current. Saitama blinked once as a sheet of water passed his face, and then continued as the beams guided him toward the basin. Darkseid observed the continued resistance with a strategic concern that had not been necessary in prior campaigns, because the Omega Effect had escalated into a sanction, intended to subordinate the target's existence to the environment's failure. The beams tightened into a brighter pair that passed through the basin's guardrail, dragging Saitama across the churning surface, where the water frothed into white. Instead of dissolving into absence beneath the pressure, he was lifted over a fallen light standard and pulled toward the downstream embankment where the soil had begun to liquefy. The trench extended beyond the concrete and into the saturated ground. Across the floodplain, evacuation sirens overlapped as communities downstream received orders to move toward higher ground, and a line of military transports repositioned along a rural highway that paralleled the river. Earthmovers attempted to cut a relief channel that might draw the trench away from a residential district, their blades sinking into mud that had already lost cohesion. The Omega Beams curved around the first cut and remained fixed, pulling Saitama up the embankment as the ground beneath him slumped in a clean trough. A row of utility poles tilted toward the channel. Genos attempted one more intercept at the crest, coordinating with responders to deploy a modular barricade anchored to bedrock. The barricade descended into place just as the beams pulled Saitama toward it, and for a moment the trench climbed the plate before cutting straight through the anchoring bolts. The bolts sheared around his shoulders, and the barricade settled into the channel as the Omega Beams followed him into the open fields beyond. Above the floodplain, Darkseid revised the sanction again, and the beams brightened without heat as they prepared to impose a correction that had once broken resistance into compliance. The first farmhouse along the projected path began to tilt as the trench reached its foundation, and the wind carried the sound of splintering wood across the fields. Saitama was pulled toward the rural road that led to the next township, still unharmed and still mildly puzzled by the persistent red light, as the water line behind him continued to drop. By the time Saitama reached the rural road, the Omega Beams had already extended their sanction beyond the plant's downstream basin and into a network of fields and irrigation lines that had never been intended to accommodate a force that could bend its own path. The asphalt lifted along the center line as the trench approached, and a parked tractor rolled forward into the shallow channel that formed beneath it, its rear wheel turning once before settling. When the beams pulled him across the road, the fence posts on either side bowed outward in a neat sequence that traced his passage toward the first cluster of homes. A weather vane spun once and then snapped free as the foundation beneath it shifted. In the township ahead, a volunteer coordinator named Layla moved door to door with a handheld radio that had begun to pick up overlapping evacuation orders from 3 different jurisdictions, because the live advisory now described a phenomenon that ignored county lines. She saw the farmhouse at the edge of the field tilt as the trench reached its base, the front porch sagging into a shallow depression that spread across the yard. The Omega Beams curved around a collapsing shed and remained fixed, pulling Saitama through a line of laundry that parted around his shoulders. The house did not fall all at once, but began with a lean that would not stop. Genos arrived at the township's perimeter as the first sirens reached the last row of residences, his sensors struggling to reconcile a sanction that now appeared to be leveraging the ground itself. Existential targeting persists, he transmitted to a command channel that had been elevated to international oversight, because the readouts still refused to acknowledge damage where the buildings were failing. Saitama glanced once at the leaning porch and then back at the red arcs touching his suit, as the trench reached the main street and lifted the cobbles into a clean line. A storefront window bowed inward and then shattered. Darkseid observed the expansion with a focus that had become strategic concern, because the Omega Effect had escalated into a sanction, intended to collapse the target's continuity across dimensional strata, and the result had been another relocation across a grocery aisle. The beams tightened into a brighter pair that passed through the market's exterior wall, dragging Saitama along a row of shelves that burst into a spill of canned goods. Instead of vanishing into a dimensional absence, he was lifted over a fallen freezer door and pulled toward the rear exit where the alley had begun to sink. The trench extended beneath the delivery bay. Across the operations floor, Akiyama authorized a regional evacuation that extended beyond the township and into the next valley, because the projected path now intersected a bridge that carried the only highway out. Military engineers attempted to rig the span for a controlled drop, hopping to deny the channel a stable crossing, and a line of transport staged along the far side to receive evacuees. The Omega Beams curved around the first demolition charge and remained fixed, pulling Saitama through the alley and toward the bridge approach as the asphalt sheared beneath his boots. Genos attempted to anchor him with a cable tied to a reinforced pylon, coordinating with a demolition team to time the drop with the beams. Next redirection. The cable snapped as the trench reached the pylon's base, and the first section of the bridge began to descend just as Saitama was pulled onto the span. Sensei remains uninjured, Genos reported, because the falling deck parted around him as the Omega Beams followed him into the gap. Vehicles that had been abandoned mid-evacuation slid into the channel and vanished from view. Above the valley, Darkseid revised the sanction once more, and the beams brightened without heat as they prepared to impose a correction that had once erased a pantheon's foothold. The bridge's central support failed in a sound that carried for miles, and the river below surged into the space it left behind. Saitama was pulled toward the far embankment, still unharmed and still mildly confused, as the span continued to fall in sections that could not be rebuilt. The moment the bridge's central support gave way, the Omega Beams did not hesitate or flicker, but followed Saitama into the collapsing span as though gravity itself had been instructed to cooperate. The deck folded beneath his boots in sections that broke apart around his legs, and a delivery van that had been abandoned mid-lane slid past him into the widening gap without contact. When the beams pulled him across the falling concrete, the rebar within it parted in sequence, tracing a clean path that extended from the broken approach to the far embankment. The river surged upward through the absence left behind, filling the space with a churning column that closed around the trench as if trying to erase the evidence. On the far side, a military convoy that had been staged to receive evacuees reversed in unison, as the live feed updated to show the channel climbing the embankment toward their position. Engineers who had prepared for a controlled drop found themselves pulling back from a collapse that had arrived ahead of schedule, and the first armored transport tilted as the soil beneath its rear axle sheared away. The Omega Beams curved around the vehicle's hull and remained fixed, pulling Saitama through a guardrail that snapped into 3 pieces before settling into the trench. He paused once to step over a loose cable, and then continued, as the continued push carried him into open ground. Genos cleared the falling edge of the span with a burst of thrusters. His systems were routing power to maintain stability as the air filled with dust and mist. Temporal displacement attempt detected, he transmitted, because the Omega Effect's latest sanction had registered as a distortion that should have removed the target from the present moment. Instead, Saitama emerged from the settling debris with a smear of river mud on his glove, looking down at it briefly as the red arcs touched his suit. The trench reached the highway beyond and lifted the painted lines into a neat ridge. Darkseid observed the failure with a calculation that had moved beyond irritation into strategic concern, because the sanction intended to unmake the target across moments had produced another relocation across asphalt. The beams tightened into a narrower pair that passed through a roadside barrier, dragging Saitama along the shoulder as the convoy repositioned to create a corridor for the last civilians still on foot. Instead of disappearing into a temporal absence, he was lifted over a fallen signpost and pulled toward a rail line that paralleled the valley. The trench extended beneath the gravel bed. Across the operations floor, Akiyama coordinated with rail authorities to halt traffic along the projected path, because the next redirection intersected a freight corridor that carried hazardous materials. A train that had been braking for a stop shuddered as the trench reached its lead bogie, and a tanker car tilted toward the channel before being steadied by its coupling. The Omega beams curved around the car's rounded hull and remained fixed, pulling Saitama across the ties as the ballast shifted beneath him. The rails bowed outward and then parted. Genos attempted to interpose again, coordinating with responders to deploy a reinforced plate across the line in the hope of buying seconds for the convoy to clear. The plate descended into place just as the beams pulled Saitama toward it, and for a moment the trench climbed the surface before cutting straight through its anchor points. The anchors sheared around his shoulders, and the plate settled into the channel as the Omega beams followed him into the industrial yard beyond. Above the valley, Darkseid revised the sanction once more, and the beams brightened without heat as they prepared to impose a correction that had once broken a world's last resistance. A storage tank at the yard's edge began to tilt as the trench reached its base, and the wind carried the sound of stressed metal across the open ground. Saitama was pulled toward the tank farm, still unharmed and still mildly puzzled by the persistent red light, as the first seam along the nearest vessel began to split. The first seam along the storage tank did not rupture all at once, but opened in a careful, creeping line that followed the trench as it reached the vessel's base, because the Omega beams had begun to leverage every point of structural weakness the environment could offer. Saitama was pulled across the industrial yard toward the tank farm, his boots sliding over gravel that parted beneath him in a clean trough, while the red arcs threaded through a web of safety railings. When the beams guided him between two service ladders, the nearest one snapped free of its mounts and fell into the channel that formed beneath his path. He glanced once at the tilting cylinder, and then back at the coupon still caught between his fingers. At the perimeter, hazmat teams initiated a withdrawal that would leave the yard unsecured, because the live advisory now described a sanction that could not be contained by distance or material. A line of foam cannons attempted to blanket the base of the nearest tank, but the Omega beams curved around the spray and remained fixed, pulling Saitama toward a manifold that regulated the farm's internal pressure. The trench extended beneath it, and the manifold's bolts began to turn in their housings without tools. A service truck rolled forward into the shallow channel and came to rest against a pipe rack that had begun to bow. Genos arrived on a gantry that overlooked the yard as the first tank tilted another degree, his sensors now registering a gradient that suggested the sanction was attempting to subordinate the target by unmaking the space around him. Spatial continuity failure persists, he transmitted to a command channel that had been elevated to multinational coordination, because the readout still refused to acknowledge damage where the structures were surrendering. Saitama was pulled along the manifold's base as a pressure gauge shattered into a spray of glass, and the trench reached the seam that had begun to open. Darkseid observed the continued survival with a focus that had become strategic concern bordering on necessity, because the Omega Effect had escalated into a sanction intended to erase the target's presence across dimensional adjacency. The beams tightened into a denser pair that passed through the tank's outer wall, dragging Saitama along the interior catwalk where the metal had begun to ripple. Instead of vanishing into a dimensional absence, he was lifted over a fallen access hatch and pulled toward the opposite side where the yard sloped toward a pipeline corridor. The trench extended beneath the catwalk supports. Across the operations floor, Akiyama authorized a regional shutdown of pipeline flow, because the projected path now intersected a conduit that fed multiple provinces. Valves began to turn along miles of buried line, their motors whining as pressure equalized, and a maintenance crew abandoned a trench that had been opened for routine inspection. The Omega beams curved around the first valve housing and remained fixed, pulling Saitama through a fence that parted around his shoulders as the ground beneath it sheared. The nearest tank finally gave way, settling into the channel with a sound that carried across the yard. Genos attempted one more intercept at the corridor's edge, coordinating with engineers to deploy a reinforced cradle beneath a suspended section of pipe. The cradle descended into place just as the beams pulled Saitama toward it, and for a moment the trench climbed the structure before cutting straight through its anchoring plates. The plates sheared around his shoulders, and the cradle settled into the channel as the Omega Beams followed him into the open land beyond. Above the industrial complex, Darkseid revised the sanction again, and the beams brightened without heat as they prepared to impose a correction that had once erased an empire's foothold. The pipeline corridor began to sink in a clean line that extended toward a distant township, and the wind carried the smell of turned earth across the fields. Saitama was pulled along the corridor, still unharmed and still mildly confused by the persistent red light, as the trench continued toward a horizon that would not hold. By the time Saitama reached the rise where the pipeline corridor met the outskirts of the next township, the Omega Beams had already exhausted every sanctioned correction that had ever reduced a target to absence, because the trench that followed him now cut through farmland, access roads, and the foundations of buildings that had not yet been evacuated. The ground beneath his boots parted in a clean, unwavering line that extended toward a communications tower on the horizon, and a line of windbreak trees bowed as the channel reached their roots. When the beams guided him across a drainage ditch, the culvert beneath it snapped and settled into the trough that formed beneath his path. He stepped over a fallen mailbox without looking, still holding the crumpled coupon as the red arcs touched his suit. In the command center, the multinational channel had gone quiet in the way of rooms that understand a threshold has been crossed, because the live map no longer showed a localized disaster, but a permanent alteration that would not be repaired in a fiscal year or a decade. Akiyama watched the trench extend beyond the township's first row of homes and into a schoolyard where the swings had been left moving by the wind, and she realized that the advisory had run out of categories. "Continuity loss confirmed," she said, though the words did not belong to any protocol they had ever written. The Omega Beams curved around a toppled goalpost and remained fixed, pulling Saitama across the cracked asphalt of a basketball court. Genos arrived at the yard's edge as the communications tower began to tilt, his systems now routing data through channels that had been intended for orbital threats. "All known Omega Sanctions have failed," he transmitted, because the readout still refused to acknowledge damage where the environment had been unmade to compensate. Saitama was pulled along the court's painted lines as they lifted into a neat ridge beneath him, and he paused once to look up at the tower's slow descent before continuing. The trench reached the tower's base. Above the altered landscape, Darkseid committed the Omega Effect to a final imposition that had once erased the last refuge of a species from the record of its own history, because strategic concern had become necessity in the face of a variable that could not be reconciled. The beams tightened into a single, unbroken arc that passed through the tower's lattice, dragging Saitama along the maintenance road as the structure surrendered in sections that fell without striking him. Instead of vanishing into an absence that would satisfy any equation, he was lifted over a fallen panel and pulled toward the edge of a quarry that had been dormant for years. The trench extended to its lip. Across the operations floor, Raman watched the quarry's rim give way in a clean, deliberate line that extended into the void, and he understood that the path would not end where the city's maps did. Military units that had staged along the last viable highway received an order that contained no destination, because there was nowhere left to divert what had already been imposed. The Omega Beams curved around a stack of rusted equipment and remained fixed, pulling Saitama across the gravel as it parted beneath him. Genos attempted to anchor him one final time with a tether tied to a bedrock anchor that had been drilled into the quarry's wall decades earlier, coordinating with engineers who knew the stone by name. The tether snapped as the trench reached the anchor's base, and the rim collapsed in a sequence that carried Saitama into open air. "Sensei remains uninjured," Gino said, because the falling rock parted around him as the Omega Beams followed him into the descent. At the quarry's floor, the channel met bedrock and continued, carving a permanent scar into a layer that had not been touched in centuries, because the sanction that had failed to erase him had instead rewritten the world to accommodate his continued presence. The river upstream would never return to its banks, the bridge would not be rebuilt, and the plant's intake would remain a monument to a release that could not be reversed. Saitama landed in the settling dust, looked at the red light for a moment longer, and then up at the sky that no longer agreed with itself. The Omega Beams did not let go, and the trench did not stop.